examples of what you refer to as anti-gypsyism?
I define anti-gypsyism as a special form of racism directed against those stigmatized in the social imaginary as gypsies, Zigeuner, Zingari, Tsigan, Tatars, or other pejorative terms that has at its core the assumption that these people are inferior and deviant, and of course which justifies their domination and oppression. There are other assumptions in this form of racism against these people. Backwardness, nomadism, ruthlessness, and Orientalism. I'll not go into details about this. However, what I want to say is that in terms of terminology, there are different terms used to describe the special form of racism against Roma. One is anti-gypsyism. Another term is more neutral, anti-Roma racism. And there are some other terms like Romaphobia, anti-Romaism, and so on. I personally prefer anti-gypsyism, anti-Roma racism, with pluses and minuses. Let me give some examples what I mean by anti-gypsyism or anti-Roma racism. These are forms of racism that have a collective impact that go beyond individual discrimination or simple prejudices and stereotypes. This means action, and that targets the whole group. For example, school segregation of Roma children. This happens all over Central and Eastern Europe, but also in Western Europe, and very close in Stockholm. In recent years, there was a case of Roma school segregation in Stockholm, and was very present in the media. Over Central and Eastern Europe, this is a very widespread form of racism against Roma. Then you have ghettoization of Roma. You have legislation that apparently is neutral, but which targets Roma. Then you have police violence targeting Romani communities. And here I'll give few examples also that happen in Sweden, but also in Norway. The fact that police, even nowadays, has records and files with Roma living in these countries, that's the supreme form of anti-gypsyism. This is a continuation of Nazi policies, to deal with Roma. And this is happening in democratic states, So I think this is something that the societies have to address, even in those countries that are seen as, solid democracies, like Sweden and Norway. Then we have gender discrimination targeting Romani women, for example, like forced sterilization that was documented in Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, and there are informal practices that led to those sterilization in other countries. But here was documented.
You mean they were facing this historically or still?
Historically and until recently, including in the 90s. And for these injustices, Roma should be compensated, but also the governments and the societies should make sure that something like that will not happen again. Then we have other forms of anti-gypsyism or anti-Roma racism that are more subtle. The fact that the governments do not include in the mainstream curricula any info on Roma and their history and culture, it's a very egregious form of racism because it erases from the collective public memory the Roma contribution to the development of those societies, their contribution to culture and arts and so on. So for that reason, there is such an ignorance in these societies about Roma culture and so on, or prejudices and stereotypes feed on this ignorance. So I would say it's a specific mechanism of ignoring deliberately the contribution of Roma to these societies. I would add another mechanism, the selective implementation of the laws. For example, when it comes to Roma kids, the best interest of the child is not necessarily followed when it comes to put in practice the legislation. The governments focus more on the punitive aspect of the laws instead of distributing also benefits equally to Roma like to every other person. But there are other forms subtle, like how recognizing Roma as a national minority and therefore being entitled for those rights. Some governments are either not recognizing Roma as a national minority, or when they recognize, they make such distinctions, such restrictive definitions, that Roma become insignificant. Example, here in Norway, the definition of national minority is restricted only to those indigenous people. So that means that the size of Roma minority, if you look officially, it's very small in Norway, while in fact you have Norwegian citizens of Roma origin that migrated later on here, and they are not the target of these policies. Then you have also EU citizens of Roma origin that came or come even temporarily to work here, and they are not part of that. Why? They become non-Roma when they move here? Yeah, that was the assumption. So as a way to restrict the rights of the Roma, these narrowing definitions, yeah, is one tool to enforce anti-gypsyism. Another example of anti-gypsyism is the use of law to specifically target Roma through apparently neutral formulations. Let me give an example. Here in Oslo, the authorities adopted legislation banning sleeping in public parks. Luckily, we had the reaction of the Lutheran bishop, mobilized her constituency, slept in parks with 120 priests, forcing the authorities to withdraw the bill. But that was targeting Roma, especially Roma migrants living on the streets in Oslo. And it was an apparently neutral formulation. Also in Copenhagen, the government is using a 1926 law to deal with Roma immigrants, not only sleeping in public parks, but also for alleged camping. So here are two examples how laws target Roma under neutral formulas. Behind this, there are other practices like the enforcement of it, and police going and targeting people and chasing them early in the morning. Yeah. Besides the horrible conditions to sleep outside, you have to run away from the police. Then also, for example, in Copenhagen, the frisk and the fines you get, yeah, for doing that, it's a form of much deeper racism than simple indirect or even direct discrimination. So anti-gypsyism is more than just discrimination. Comes with the packages of practices that represent also the power to dominate and oppress these people.